thank you all very much for being with us and for participating in our presentations. You've heard all our presenters, our panelists. I'm once again very grateful for their presence and for their contribution. The topic that we are discussing is a very complex one, so obviously we needed perhaps to spend so much time. So once again, we are deconstructing and reinterpreting intolerance or tolerance, and we are doing it from a transdisciplinary perspective. We had quite a lot of presenters, and I would now like to open the floor once again and encourage them all to give us their final thoughts, not necessarily final, but perhaps not final, definitely not final, but thoughts that will perhaps give us a more insightful or give us a better understanding of everything and anything that we discussed this afternoon. It was a multidisciplinary perspective that we tried to kind of delve into, but let us now try and see whether we can come up with some common ground and whether we can possibly make some recommendations in order to make the world a better place, as I told you at the very beginning. So we can go in a particular order or no particular order. I'm simply opening it now to giving the floor to our panelists and asking you to give or share your thoughts with us, whatever you would like us to say. Or to the audience as well, of course to the audience. Of course to the audience. There was no time for questions, true. And to the audience as well. So the floor is yours.
Maybe I should pick up on what
you.
Okay, what you talked about in your presentation. I didn't have a chance to show it, but there was a study by Dong and colleagues 2008 that looked at intercultural sensitivity, a concept that was developed by Chen Starosta. And they tested it to see whether intercultural sensitivity would increase intercultural awareness or cultural awareness, and therefore also make people a little bit more tolerant towards other viewpoints. And they did find a positive correlation. A similar type of study was conducted also in Germany by Lin and by another one by Thomas. And what's also interesting is, since you had the lie aspect, there have also been some studies that were done that looked at language ability, and Greenholz did a study that did also confirm that as people are learning other languages, they do become also more tolerant towards others. And then there was another one that showed, I think it was Kaiser, who showed that people who are using English as a second language, interestingly, or not surprisingly enough, actually were more able to react to what people are actually saying instead of blending things out, because we do sometimes only hear what we wish to hear. The reason being that because people are worried that they might say or do something wrong, they're more focused on the actual dialogue, whereas people who are native speakers tend to very often not focus so much. So I think probably as members of the lie community, we have sort of the tools to make the, as you said quite correctly, Svetlana, to make the world a better place.
Send us the references.
It's in the references. It's in there. It's in there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
I have one comment concerning the term or the expression, the crisis of multiculturalism. I think we have to put clear distinction between historical multiculturalism and migration-based multiculturalism. This is the ongoing crisis of migration-based multiculturalism, because Europe has witnessed positive historical multiculturalism for centuries, except during Second World War and during Yugoslavian crisis. But for centuries, Europeans have lived in harmony and they didn't face any crisis of, in the medieval ages, yes, probably. Yeah.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Tanya, would you like to say something? Tanya? No? Monica? Something about your project?
Yeah, I was actually waiting for some comments from the audience. Yes, I was looking at Kasia because you're looking at me. So, yeah, so I think I will give the floor first to the audience and then I will add something.
Thank you.
If I may ask a question related to the project, which is very, very interesting and extensive and I think worth doing. Do you have any materials, any data on how the Polish respondents compare to the other countries? Are Polish people, Polish students more accepting of these hate comments or not?
We are actually right now in we will be in the process of comparing the results of the surveys from these 10 different countries involved in the project. But with Fabienne, we are going to give a talk about it at IPRA conference. And the interesting thing is that initially we were planning to talk about questionnaires, and then there are also interviews, that in-depth interviews, which follow this, somehow follow up on this questionnaire. Our colleague from Denmark, who was supposed to present the results with us, said, well, we don't really have any interesting results in Denmark because, we don't really have that much, hate speech. And so it's interesting. But we are really looking forward to actually seeing what the situation looks like in different countries. Like we have a partner in Lithuania, for example, and we are really waiting to see whether there will be interesting differences or not.
And of course, we have to emphasize that the same questionnaire was actually administered to respondents across countries actually that participate in the project. So obviously after the data get processed, I think that we will have actually a perfect ground for comparing these results, and hopefully at the final stage of the project actually we will have a nice basis for comparison and a good comparative results, right? And also I would like to get back to this educational aspect which emerged in particular from the results of the Polish questionnaire, right? This reaction to instances of insults or threats on various grounds, including ethnic grounds. And in this particular context in Poland, which inevitably will become more multicultural in the future, the results show that there is a need to educate, because this lack of awareness how to react to such instances is visible. People simply don't know what to do about it. And also the fact that actually about 10%, 9.6% actually of respondents claim that it's too common an occurrence actually to report it, which shows that there is a need actually to make actually people more in Poland more sensitive actually to such situations, right? Mm-hmm.
And I think it's necessary also because, Svetlana, you mentioned the need for these sort of intercultural workshops. And this is what I sort of realized after talking with the representative of the regional police department in Łódź, who told me that, well, all the policemen from the Łódź region have been trained in terms of identifying hate speech. But she said, okay, but because we are going to have workshops for them also. He said, but we would like you to concentrate also on this intercultural components, because they know how to identify hate speech, but they don't know how to you know, be sensitive to intercultural differences. And this is the main problem when they, for example, have to deal with victims of hate speech or hate crime. So this is, she said, the most problematic thing now.
I would also like to ask about the project Contact. Well, I'm curious whether you have some linguistic tools to decide whether give an example is an example actually of hate speech. I mean, those examples that you gave were quite clear, but I can imagine that it is not always so easy to evaluate, yes, to decide whether it is hate speech or not. You gave those 4 possible definitions, yes, of hate speech, understood as making negative, prejudiced remarks, insulting someone, threatening, or finally encouraging to be violent. Well, hate speech understood as encouraging to be violent, I think that it might be quite easy to capture. But on the other hand, hate speech understood as insulting someone may not. Well, have you got any lists of insults or, I don't know, insulting expressions, something, well, some help, yes, to decide? Thank you. But thank you for your presentation, and it was extremely interesting.
We will actually be discussing the sort of linguistic aspects of identifying hate speech tomorrow during our contact session. Because, and also the sort of legal component, because it's also interesting to see how in these different countries hate speech is or is not, you know, identified, defined within law. Like in Polish law, there is no explicit definition of hate speech as such. In the criminal code or civil code. So tomorrow we'll be talking about these definitions and then also how we try to identify instances of hate speech in the data that we analyzed.
Sorry, sir. Can you just repeat that? Can you just repeat that so that we can...
I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
I just asked, just in terms of what they said, do you think that there are some societies which are just more used to hearing aggressive and hate speech and they are just not that sensitive to perceiving it as such?
I think when we look at online hate speech in Poland, we realize that there is much more actually of hate speech here when compared to, I don't know, British society, which is perhaps, you know, related to politeness. Or I don't know, if we go back to cultural dimensions, maybe also this feminine masculine dimension, but I'm not sure. I would also look for role of, I would say, the public debate culture and how it, so whether it exists, let's say, in a given culture or not. So I think this is also a factor. But yeah, there are very interesting differences.
I'm not part of this project, but I can just give perhaps a short comment. Again, this is not based on any particular research or anything. It is more impressionistic. It is obviously taken very seriously in Britain, not just issues in hate speech, but, for example, I don't know, recognizing issues of, let's say, pedophilia in online discourses, or generally, not necessarily online discourses. So I think it is taken very seriously. You mentioned police, you know, a kind of people people working in, or policemen generally, or other professionals, training sessions. I know for sure that this has been happening in Britain for many years now, not just for instances of hate speech, but generally to raise their awareness, what sort of, what is communicated in a sense, so probably some sort of pragmatic as well, knowledge of so just to sensitize them, to be able to recognize things much more easily. I know that is happening. So when you mentioned the sessions that you are going to have here with policemen and other people, I know, again, this is extremely important. If you just allow me, I'm sorry I'll definitely give you the chance to ask a question. If you just let me, it is an anecdote, but basically it is a real thing. It happened in real life. It was many years ago, basically our colleagues from University of Malta, two professors there who are in the Department of Education, but looking at intercultural issues in interculturality. I think this was the story from, let's say, 2008 or something like that, so quite some time ago. They said they were contacted by, Ministry of Interior or something like that in Malta, basically saying, so, you just have to understand it was almost 10 years ago. So, all the vocabulary, the terminology was not perhaps, people were not aware of these things. So they were sort of contacted with a relatively strange kind of request. They said, well, we have a problem here. Our prison officers. So Malta, a very, a tiny sort of country, you would imagine, okay, prison officers, who do they work with? Some kind of petty criminals, it's a very peaceful society. So who are the people who are, some petty criminals, whatever. Why would they have a problem? But this is the way the problem was described to these professors. He said, all of a sudden, you see with these sort of refugees coming from Africa and other places and ending up in Malta, there are women, there are children, different cultures, and our prison officers simply have a problem. They don't know how to interact with them. Yeah. So again, Maltese culture, small, insular kind of. Yeah. All of a sudden, it was the first time where they were, so there were women and children, not necessarily in detention, but police was in charge of those. So all of a sudden said, so we have a problem, can you help us? And of course, they immediately detected, okay, it's intercultural communication. This is the problem, this is what you need. And they designed, so we're talking about 10 years ago, designed a course in intercultural communication for prison officers in Malta. So my point is, whenever people say, it's intercultural communication, come on, stop it. We heard all this, just stop it. It's the story, we heard it so many times, why do we need it? My answer is precisely this. If prison officers in Malta felt the need to be trained in interculturalism, of course the whole world needs it. That's my point. Want to say something, Johnny?
Just a few words, yes.
Yes.
I'd like to say that the project is really extremely interesting on hate speech and extremely important. And if you, actually I wish I could participate in it because it is really something topical and necessary. But if you talk about intercultural comparison, I think you also need to take into consideration emotional aspect of communication. Again, I emphasize the fact of cultural differences of communication and differences in communicative styles. So if culture encourages people to feel free in expressing emotions, so they maybe would use hate speech more frequently. Yeah, when culture encourages people to be emotionally reserved, like British culture, so maybe they are more, how to say, reserved in this aspect as well. I think it is also very important. Maybe it is not just what people think, the level of the tolerance, but how they react. So this emotional aspect, I think it is really very important. It's my hypothesis, but I think it is worth considering.
And just one observation, actually, because there was this question how Poland fares here. Actually, I think it's also important actually not to generalize to a large extent, because very often what happens now is basically dependent or contingent on sentiment in the society at a given moment. Like, for example, it was 2 weeks ago when I actually saw a cover of Polityka Weekly, a Polish weekly, and there was this result of a sociological study that showed that actually that among many other things, the Poles are most afraid of refugees and terrorism. And then we go back actually to, we refer to the presentation delivered early in the morning by Ludmiła Archimaviciana, who also said that in Lithuania there is a refugee crisis without refugees, and apparently the sentiment, the mood in the society is quite similar in Poland actually. So these generalizations should be actually looked at contingent on what's happening actually in political, social and cultural environment, but also with reference to media context, because very often this is subject actually to how media present certain problems. So that's it. Sorry about it.
You've been waiting for quite some time now. Finally, yes.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to join what other people said, that the project is very interesting and very ambitious. But I do have two questions, actually. The first one is, being a French resident but not French born, I was actually intrigued by the fact that France was not part of the people, the universities, or at least the countries collaborating in your project. I mean, immigration crisis is a very big issue in France, and especially for people who have been following the latest French election. There was a lot of hot debate over this. So I just wanted to know whether do you have any plans to include France in your project. The second question is actually about the way you're trying to collect data about the attitudes. If I have, you were saying that you were using questionnaires and interviews. My question is, when it comes to attitudes, especially towards sensitive issues like religion, racism, sexism, and so on, people usually have a tendency to have to express overt attitudes and inner attitudes. So how can you make sure that the data you collect through the questionnaires and the interviews really reflects how people feel, or at least say how they really feel about hate crime? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Could it be a question for everybody, not just the contact people, yes?
So to answer the question about France, officially it's not a project partner, but our coordinator, Professor Fabienne Beider, is actually of French origin. So we somehow have this French perspective, and she also looks at French radical discourses, if you like. But yes, it's a pity that officially we don't have any university from France. Also because of, some technical issues related to involvement in the project. And another thing about questionnaires, I mean, the questionnaires were anonymous. And it's true that you can see the difference in what we have in questionnaires and then what we have in interviews. So in interviews, people are, of course, much more likely to sort of say, oh, I'm against hate speech. Although there are some things that are similar, like explaining why hate speech incidents are not reported, for example. So. To differ slightly, yes, in some respects to be different.
Since France was mentioned, also Germany also, obviously not just because of 2015 with approximately 1 million refugees coming and creating a tremendous problem. You can actually see this in some of the state elections and local elections. that the alternative for Germany, which is sort of Front National equivalent, in a couple of state legislatures actually got up to 20% of the popular vote. So there's a fairly large reservoir for people involved. And it's also interesting how in city Dresden, the Pegida movement is still ongoing with a lot of open hate speech directed not just at migrants, but also even at German politicians who, in Pegida's viewpoint, are responsible for creating the problem. And what was also very interesting in Germany just recently, Turkish citizens living in Germany were permitted to vote on President Erdogan's change in the constitution, giving him more political power. And in Germany, you have ethnic Turks and also ethnic Kurds who hold Turkish citizenship. And there was tremendous, you could actually follow this also in the social media, Facebook quite openly, the hatred that was going on, the hate speeches between those two ethnic groups revolving around the vote. So it's also not just mainstream society, but also even ethnic groups.
Are there more questions? Oh, sorry, I want to say something. Are there more questions? You want me to ask something? Yes? Yes.
As a humor, maybe while listening to this session, so I think there were kind of two cross points that I observed as a listener. One of them is, it seemed to me that this negative perception of otherness, whether it's hate speech or through other sources that were discussed, can be humor or any other, it can have kind of sensory motor motivation, because usually we are always fearful of something that is unknown, that is not a part of us. And my question is, would you tend to agree that this kind of polarization and high level of hatred, we can say so, is particularly motivated by political legitimacy and social legitimacy that is given to this fear of the unknown? Because as in my research, media grounding, and we also have political populism, and this is how political legitimacy is given to this hatred, that it's a kind of a standard, and then this violent behavior and attitudes toward the other is given legitimacy, and it's spreading with incessant speed. And then we have to talk about it, and as you said, and educate people. And I also mentioned to my colleague that some time ago, after Soviet Union collapse, in my country we had workshops on universal human rights, when we talk about similarities through differences, and we kind of were taught that differences are a part of our similarity, and we should accept differences not from fear, but as a part of the known, but positively. And now maybe it seems a time to go back to this kind of education. So my question was, would you tend to agree that hatred or fear of the unknown is given political and social legitimacy in societies that you analyze or that you represent? Thank you.
I think I would agree if you're asking me, but whoever would like to answer again, contact people. There are 9 other panelists. Okay, contact people.
I agree. I mean that it's that you can see the impact of what I would call kind of social and political acceptance of which, of course, it's related to increasing nationalism and populism all across Europe, and I think Poland can be an example here too. But I just, because Svetlana said that contact dominated the discussion, but I think this is a very good example of how networks like ENIEDA, it actually shows why we need research that is conducted within such networks. And so why we need panels like this to actually compare these different approaches and perspectives, and why we need education and then trainings offered to various social groups.
I agree. Absolutely. Are there any more
So not to dominate discussion by the contact matters, I'd like to comment on or maybe ask question about the LIE or LI idea, because I'm an intercultural trainer and I'm also interested in the concept of clear teaching, which is content and language integrated learning, which as I think is quite close to this idea. And content and language integrated learning means, in practice, that a teacher needs double teaching qualifications, because in fact he or she is supposed to be a school subject specialist and at the same time a foreign language teacher, or sometimes they are only language teachers and they have to, but no, it doesn't work like this. It's quite easier to be a school subject teacher and to gain some foreign language teaching qualifications. Unless someone has 2 diplomas, and I used to teach biology in English, for example. And my question is there any systemic solution to provide teachers with the possibility to gain the intercultural knowledge? Because this is developing of intercultural awareness or sensitivity is quite complex, sometimes lengthy process, and how to somehow encourage teachers to gain this kind of knowledge, to learn themselves, to be a sort of intercultural trainers for the students.
Thank you very much, Julita, for this wonderful question. Absolutely, there should be a systemic, you call it a systemic approach. Yes, absolutely. Does it exist? Partially, somewhere it does, somewhere it doesn't. Are we sort of going in that direction? I believe, yes, we are going in that direction. This is partly why I believe networks like ENIEDA should exist, and this is again something that we do. We collaborate among ourselves, our institutions, universities, and we individually. We are working on models, possible models. That was something that I also wanted to tell you about, but unfortunately we ran out of time. I myself, with other colleagues, not just me, with other colleagues, I've been sort of, let's say, well, working on a possible educational model that would encourage the students.
Yes, it should be a part of any national curricula, I would say.
Absolutely, yes. So in a sense, I myself, you know, kind of have devised, if I may say so, a possible model that will encourage all the things that you mentioned. What about, basically what you are saying is, okay, teacher training. Do we need to rethink, redesign or upgrade teacher training? Absolutely, yes. Should it be a coordinated action? I very much believe so. Should it be in the context of Europe, or should it be transnational? I would personally like it to be transnational, you know, to look at peculiarities, culture specificities globally, but also to look for some common ground or sort of some values that need to be incorporated absolutely globally. So yes, very directly, a very direct, concrete answer to your question. There should be a systemic and systematic approach. I believe it does exist here and there. We are in the process of, obviously, it is the final goal, the ultimate goal that we would like to achieve. And probably it is, you know, it will take some time, but I believe we are getting there. And it is, again, part of that, making the world a better place for all. So it is part of, you know, a very, very big agenda. So teachers as intercultural trainers, education as a very nice intercultural experience and journey, intercultural journey, all these concepts should be central, and I believe we should definitely devote ourselves and our time more to that. So it's not just language, you know, within language education or language curricula, it should be cross-curricular. That is my. Did you want to say, Jagoda, something else?
Nothing more, but maybe no, maybe that any sort of hate speech or linguistic intolerance should not be tolerated at all. I would say.
don't know what to add.
Clear signal conveyed. Yes, clear signal, yes.
I think I will take the role of a chair. So do we have any more comments or questions?
I just wanted to ask, because you said that all these kind of racist, sexist comments shouldn't be tolerated, and it's absolutely clear. But on the other hand, I was wondering how would you like to introduce it into the Polish culture, which is, especially in the lower social classes, it's quite common to hear this kind of sexist remarks, sexist, racist, and all kinds of intolerance speech, hate speech. And I was wondering, because it's very easy, in my opinion, it's very easy to cross the border between being serious and being ridiculed in the eyes of the lower class. I don't know if I should say it, put it in this way, but still, it's just easy. Like with feminists in Poland, a lot of times they are not treated seriously, although they are supposed to. But many times you can hear comments, "Oh, they are burning their panties again. Don't worry," or something like this. And I was wondering if you have any kind of idea how you would introduce it in, for example, among policemen who are strong, masculine characters, and sometimes they wouldn't consider what we considered hate speech as even something negative. And this is the question.
Who is going to answer? Monica again? Sorry. That's okay.
Actually, that's what the representative of the regional department, police department, told me, who is a woman herself. She said, "Be ready that this workshop is going to be quite challenging. So be prepared." Because this is the group, the professional group that has, and of course mostly masculine culture, let's say, that has, I mean, these people have their attitudes, and of course not, officially, they are not supposed to say certain things, but what they think, they think. And this actually brings us back to your presentation about, perceptions, attitudes, prejudice, etc. But again, to answer this question, I think again it's a matter of, in general, it's a matter of education and educating people. And what I think, Ludmila, you mentioned it today in your presentation, that people are afraid of something that they don't know, or someone they don't know, something that's different. So I think it's also about yes. So I think this trainings, workshops should actually be aimed at raising this intercultural awareness, because this is what we can also see looking at our students. Or I have the intercultural communication course for students. And this is a large, let's say, group with students from 30 different countries, because we have a lot of Erasmus and international students. And I can see how they actually, what they learn, or they learn mostly not from what I say, but from interaction with one another, when they are supposed to work on the project together. And this is how they actually change their attitudes. You wanted to comment on this?
You have to be careful, and I hate to be the one to sort of, be the person who's a little bit maybe negative now. The people that you're talking about, they're going to be in their group, and whenever they hear other contradictory messages, they're going to have, according to Feistinger's theory, so much dissonance that they're just not going to accept it. They're going to ignore it. And they're going to rationalize also and sort of say, oh, these are the crazy feminists who are doing these things. Let them do it. You know, they're not going to be taken seriously. They're going to continue to believe what they are doing. The research seems to indicate that yes, it is possible, but you would have to change the peer groups with which they identify themselves. But that's also going to be difficult to get these people out of that. With children, it's a little bit easier because they're still developing their identity. So here we can have an influence on, as far as the education is concerned, and trying to sort of get them to have more sensitivity. I think also college-level students, especially international ones, because of who they are and the experiences that they've made and are making, are also going to be probably more receptive to such messages. But someone who's fixed in most of his mind when it comes to such issues, it's going to be extremely difficult to change that, I think. So problem is obviously, you know, what do you do with them? I really don't know. Make the laws tougher, but sending them to prison is probably not going to help too much either. So I don't know what the answer really is to this. It's difficult. Some of them you may be able to convince. I mean, this is what Leica did in his study in the 60s, where he sort of said, get the people involved in projects. He also pointed out he did it in an organizational context, where he was talking about people from the factory floor now working together with some people from management. And he said that it can change people's opinions if they work together over a longer period of time to sort of see that there are different perspectives. But again, even he had to admit that it wasn't possible for everyone. And that Hamburg example I gave you was with children, where it did work, but I think it's because these kids were still developing who they are. But someone who's you know, shaved his head and has the tattoos and who has those views, I think that's going to be difficult. I mean, they're not going to take us seriously. I'll probably get punched into my face if I say something to that effect.
Yes, so we've been talking a lot about how we should organize cultural workshops for teachers and stuff like that. So I can just, if I can give just two examples, one from Croatia and one from India. Last year I had a workshop with high school students in Croatia on nonviolence. And as long as we talked about history, Gandhi, and things that were far and removed from their experience, everything was fine. They were totally for nonviolence and totally for non-hate speech and stuff like that. Then I asked them, okay, and then I gave them a practical assignment that they had to debate on things that were happening right now in Croatia, and that's where the hate speech sparked, and it came out of nowhere. Some of them were quite shocked by the things that their co-students told in that debate. But what's interesting, the language which those children used was actually media language. It wasn't something that they made up. It was something that they heard or read or heard their parents discussing using media language. And the same happens in India. I had a discussion with a very educated Indian person about terrorism, because it happens, it's a crucial and hot topic in India. And his words at some point in discussion were, well, all terrorists are Muslims, aren't they? So that means we should hate Muslims. And that's also something that came from the media. It wasn't his personal experience. So I think we should actually focus our workshops on the media. If the journalists are actually aware what their language does to people, politicians are for sure aware what they do. They manipulate our behavior that way. But then media should be more responsible reporting about the politicians and their actions, and because these things really influence our lives. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? No? Well, in that case, we ran out of time long ago. So basically, I would just like to invite everyone in one sentence or couple of sentences, if you feel inspired or provoked or whatever, could you give us just some final, for each panelist, could I suggest that you give us your final thoughts in a very condensed way, so 1 or 2 sentences, just to really give a final conclusion, if there is one, to this huge topic. If I can start, if I be the first one, I would say, well, first of all, thank you all. It was absolutely inspirational. It was transformational for me personally. I learned a lot from all of you. It was absolutely fantastic. If there is one word for me, final thought, final overview, I'm absolutely convinced even more now that the work of ENIEDA and similar networks is definitely needed, because there is so much to do, and absolutely I'm convinced that we'll finally manage to make the world a better place for all. But of course, there's a long way to go. There's a long way to go. It is quite a bumpy road, but I have no doubt in my mind that we are getting there through being positive and through being absolutely, devoted to what we do, how we do. We'll just raise that consciousness, the level of, wider understanding, and things will get better. I have absolutely no doubt about that. So that would be my final overview. Thank you all for raising the level of my consciousness today as well, because I learned a lot through presentations and, of course, through the questions, which were also very thought-provoking, eye-opening, and so on. So that would be my final thought and my final word. Could I just ask everybody?
Yes.